All right. Well, I think we're live. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute. Just wanted to give everybody a minute or so to log in and get situated here. So welcome all of you who are starting to sign in. Like I said, we are going to get started here in just a minute. Just want to give everyone a little bit of time to sign in and get situated. So bear with me for just a moment. Alrighty. Okay. Well, first of all, wanted to welcome you to our site's first ever Facebook Live Ranger Chat. My name is Ben Anderson. I'm a ranger with the Maggie Walker National Historic Site here in Richmond, Virginia. So happy to have you joining me today. Happy National Park Week. Of course, everyone need to get that in there as well. As I said, this is our site's first ever Facebook Live Ranger Chat. And so this is kind of a brave new world for us. Those of you that have been following national parks on Facebook and social media have maybe started to get used to this format a little bit. It's a little new to me. I know a lot of other parks are embracing it, including our sister park, Richmond National Battlefield Park as well. They're putting on a lot of great content. If you haven't seen that yet, so check them out. But I'm really happy to have you with me today. What I'm going to be doing here for about the next 30 minutes or so is leading us on a virtual tour of Richmond, Virginia. We're going to be taking a look at 4 sites in particular that have a very meaningful and important connection to Maggie Walker. The first is going to be her birth site. Then we're going to head over to her church, see her office building, and then finish up with her bank. And this is a talk that we call Maggie Walker's Richmond. Developed it several years ago, originally to be a bus tour. So obviously, a little bit of adapting in that way today. It's not going to be quite like that as we go along, but it's always a really fun talk to do. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it today is because I think there's something in this talk really for everyone. If you're coming to this talk, new to Maggie Walker, for instance, and a lot of folks who visit our site in particular do just that. This is, of course, a lot of what we're going to talk about today can be thought of as an introduction to Maggie Walker, maybe a little bit lengthy and detailed in some cases, but really a great overview of her life. We're not going to go into everything we know, but can act as a great introduction. And certainly my hope is that you would leave really as convinced as I am and the rest of our staff about how phenomenal a person Maggie Walker was, and hopefully motivated to come visit us in person as well once we reopen, which I hope is, of course, sooner rather than later. But if you're not new to Maggie Walker, maybe you've been to the site 100 times and you've been on all of our tours of Maggie Walker's home and you've memorized everything that we say in every room of her house. Well, this, of course, is a very different kind of tour that we don't do every day. In fact, by focusing on each one of these sites individually allows us to go into some detail about Maggie Walker's life that we don't typically get into on an average tour. So hopefully there's some maybe new facts in there that you haven't learned, or maybe at least in some cases some new ways to interpret those facts. But either way, I hope that you're not shy throughout. Go ahead and leave us some questions and comments there in the comment section. This may look like a one-person operation, and largely it is, but we do have another one of our rangers, Ranger Mike, who is logged in as we speak. He's going to be kind of fielding some of those comments and questions as we go. I'm going to hop on afterwards and maybe assist him with that as needed, but he's going to be addressing those as we go. So don't be shy. Let us know who you are, where you're from. Are you new to Maggie Walker? Have you been to the site? Any questions about the talk, anything like that occurs to you? Go ahead and let us know. We'd love to know. One other thing before we get started, right? As I mentioned before, we developed this talk originally as a bus tour, and obviously not doing it that way today. But I did have one idea that I thought could help make this format a bit more like the bus tour than anything else, and that is to really take advantage of the technology that's in front of us. Everybody who's logged in at the moment is likely on their phone or on a laptop, but you all have an internet connection. And one of the things that I thought we could do, this is an experiment, so bear with me, but I thought that if you opened up a new internet window, maybe go to your favorite map website, or maybe it's an app on your phone, one that will at least offer you a photographic view of of what's on the street at these addresses, or a street view, in other words, then I'll be giving you the addresses to the sites as we go. And if you can type those in to your favorite mapping website, maybe Google or Bing, then you'll actually get a view of what we would see if we were actually all on a real bus driving through Richmond. So in other words, hopefully if this works out, we're going to transform our screens into that window seat on the bus that I wish we had and just don't. But in any case, I hope that works. We'll see how this goes. Maybe we'll do it again in the future in some other format if all goes well. But last thing I wanted to cover before we head off to our first site is just a quick introduction to Maggie Walker. Having worked at the site for many years, one of the things that I have noticed a lot is that visitors tend to come to us without much knowledge about who Maggie Walker was, especially if they're coming to us from across state lines, from outside of Virginia. And so just taking a wild guess that we do have quite a few folks logged in who are maybe not from Virginia, maybe haven't heard of Maggie Walker. I just want to take a couple of minutes and introduce her to you, just so that, as we make our 4 stops today, we're all on the same page about who she is. And so to get started, Maggie Walker was, first of all, an African-American woman. She was born right here in Richmond back in 1864. This is one of my favorite photographs of her, one of many taken of her during her adult years that we're lucky to have in our collection. And she's someone who will rise to prominence right at the turn of the 20th century. Really for 2 reasons in particular. One was becoming the leader of a Black fraternal order called the Independent Order of St. Luke, and really dramatically turning that organization around. We know that at the time she gets elected head of the order, it's in 1899. It's an organization that appeared to have been on its last legs. There was only about 1,000 members at the time. They were broke financially. And under Maggie Walker's leadership, by the time we get into the mid-1920s, they have over 100,000 members, active in 24 states, and assets of upwards of $500,000. So real dramatic reversal of fortune for the Independent Order of St. Luke. And of course, on top of that, it becomes the only fraternal organization really on a national scale that had a woman in its top position, and that also offered full membership to the organization to women. So there was certainly a lot that was unique there. But on her way to achieving fame and success for all of that, Maggie Walker does also become famous and successful as an entrepreneur. She starts a newspaper, for instance, in Richmond back in 1902, calls it the St. Luke Herald. 3 years later, opens a department store in Richmond called the St. Luke Emporium. But by far, her most famous achievement overall was by opening a bank in 1903 called the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. So right in between, nestled in between the newspaper and the Emporium. And the bank will really catapult her into the national spotlight like nothing else in her life had or will do again, because once she opens that bank, she becomes the first African-American woman in the country to charter a bank and become a bank president. And one of the things that I find myself telling visitors all the time at the site is that these are achievements, just the ones I laid out here, which is in large part kind of the tip of the iceberg for Maggie Walker. But, these are achievements that ought to sound impressive to us no matter who we're talking about, no matter what their race or gender is, no matter what time period or location we're talking about. But when it comes to Maggie Walker, I think it always helps to keep the context of her life in mind, which is to say, to remember that these are the achievements of an African-American woman in the South, in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, no less. Let's not forget that. During the height of the Jim Crow era, of course, a time when racial segregation and discrimination was legal and common. Of course, it's also a time when women did not enjoy the same rights as men. Of course, many of us hopefully aware now that women didn't get to vote nationwide until 1920, just to give you an example of that. And so all things together, this is a time and place that would seem to make it as difficult as possible for someone like Maggie Walker to achieve the kinds of things that she achieved. And certainly on one hand, you could say, well, it shouldn't have been that difficult in the first place. And I would agree with you. But on the other hand, just the simple fact that she did, despite all of that, find a way to overcome and achieve during such a very difficult time is just a great reminder of how phenomenal a person she was, and just the kind of determination and courage that she had throughout her life. Maggie Walker will eventually pass away on December 15th, 1934. She was 70 years old. And one of the things that's important to know here is that she goes on to an enormous funeral. An estimated 5,000, excuse me, an estimated 5,000 people were believed to have attended the funeral, quite likely making it the largest funeral in Richmond for an individual since the Civil War. And again, the context matters here because assuming that's true, right, not only does that mean that it had been decades since Richmond had seen a funeral on that size and scope, but that the last time it had was likely for a white man and a Confederate general, someone about as different from Maggie Walker as you could possibly imagine. So it's a moment in time that I think really, really powerfully symbolizes, a lot of that change that had taken place during her time period, a lot of which, of course, she was successful in ushering in as well. And again, just reminds us how phenomenal a person she was, how much of a pioneering figure she was. So. All right, with that out of the way, let me go ahead and get us heading in the direction of our first stop, which is going to be, again, the site of Maggie Walker's birth. To do that, let me first of all give you the address. So hopefully those of you at home that are able to open up that window and get into a mapping website, go ahead and put in the address of 2301 East Grace Street. So that is, again, 2301 East Grace Street, Grace. I'll give you a minute to go ahead and do that. All right. So if you were able to do that, what you should see on your screen, you should be really close to a really large brick building that is known as the Bellevue School. Unfortunately, this is a great building. It dates back to Maggie Walker's time. It was built in 1912. And currently is an elementary school. It's part of the Richmond public school system. We get students from Bellevue at our site every year, which is always a lot of fun. But the school itself was built on the grounds of the home that Maggie Walker was actually born into. This is the home of a woman named Elizabeth Van Loo, and because it is no longer with us, all the more reason to show you some photographs of it. This one comes to us from the Valentine Museum here in Richmond. Shows you the Gray Street side. I'm not sure who that young person is there in the front, but that is the Gray Street side there. So if you've got that view of Bellevue School on your computer, this is where you would have seen this in that same location. But even more attractive, I think, is the south portico of the home, another photograph from the Valentine collection that shows really beautifully columned Greek Revival south porch that would have had a really commanding view over the James River, and just altogether a really beautiful place, I think, to have entered the world. And as I mentioned, this was the home of a woman named Elizabeth Van Loo. Elizabeth Van Loo, turns out, was not one of Maggie Walker's parents, but the reason Maggie Walker was born there is because her mother, Elizabeth Draper, who I want to show you here, was working for Elizabeth Van Loo at the time as an assistant cook and living on the site. Maggie Walker will later write in her diary in 1925, I was born in or at the Van Loo mansion, at least on the grounds. Van Loo was known to have had some other quarters on the grounds as well. And right off the bat, we have two very interesting stories here. Elizabeth Van Loo, it's a name you may have heard of before. She, as it turns out, was a very successful Union spy in Richmond during the Civil War, and a single woman living alone in this really large mansion who ends up spying for the Union Army during the Civil War. So a really fascinating story there. A lot is known and well documented about her life. But on the other hand, again, we have Elizabeth Draper, Maggie Walker's mother, who we wish we knew more about. We unfortunately don't, but the evidence that we do have suggests that she was born into slavery in the late 1840s, likely in an area called Powhatan, which is about 30 minutes or so west of Richmond, a very rural area. And evidence also suggests that in 1864, the time Maggie Walker was born, Elizabeth Draper was no longer enslaved. Now, we'd love to tell you more about how and when and why, how all of this, transitioning takes place, going from rural to urban for her and going from enslaved to free, by her teenage years. Unfortunately, we can't explain that. It's not, those aren't details that we have at this moment, but it does appear to have had a really fascinating early life prior to Maggie Walker's birth. So two fascinating stories there, but of course on top of that we do have to also include the identity of Maggie Walker's biological father, who is this man here. His name was Eccles Cuthbert. This photograph of him was thankfully shared with us by descendants of Cuthbert's family. So thank you for doing that. As you may have noticed on the photo, Cuthbert is white, also turns out to have been a Confederate soldier at the time. So at this point, if you are saying to yourself, wait a minute, you're telling me Maggie Walker was the product of a formerly enslaved woman and a Confederate soldier in the home of a Union spy in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, in 1864, while the Civil War is still going. You're absolutely right. But this is, you can't make this stuff up. I find myself telling that to visitors all the time. So you talk about making an entrance into this world. Boy, does Maggie Walker do that in really dramatic fashion. And, one of the things that I like to think about when we consider this moment in her life, considering kind of the coming together of these three lives, is just how much of the fabric of this country was really represented between the three of them. Because when you back up and you think about it, right, we have the coming together really of course, not just black and white, but between Union sympathies and a Confederate soldier. We have, through Maggie Walker's mother, someone who had experienced slavery and was currently emancipated, but also kind of the combination of an immigrant and native-born American. So it's as if really kind of the fabric of who we were as a country really comes together dramatically at that point to bring Maggie Walker into the world. And, I think when you think about it that way, it almost seems predestined that she goes on to fame the way she does. But in any case, a very interesting way to think about it. Ultimately, we know that Maggie Walker and her mother, they do not stay at the Van Loo mansion too terribly long. In 1868, when Maggie is just 4 years old, her mother marries a man named William Mitchell, who's an African-American, working for Elizabeth Van Loo. He was her butler. At the time, he had been enslaved during the war, but appears to have been freed afterwards while working for Van Loo. And this young family of three will, in 1868, move west of the Churchill neighborhood into a small home on a street called College Alley, and begin their new lives as a family there. And one of the two things have always struck me as really significant about this moment. One of them is that this was likely the first time in Maggie Walker's mother and stepfather's lives that they were exercising some say in terms of where they lived. And in other words, that where they were living was not predetermined by a slave owner or an employer. And I think what makes that especially significant is when you again think about the time period. This is 1868. The Civil War has just ended 3 years earlier. Slavery has only ended 3 years earlier. And so when you start thinking about what this next chapter in American history is going to look like, what is it looking like? What kinds of, especially from the African American experience is concerned, right? What kinds of freedoms are being experienced really for the first time? And this one is a big one, right? Exercising the right, or really the freedom to choose where you wanted to live. And so it's a seemingly small act in some ways, but it's one that I think really symbolizes this new era that the country had entered, and it was just freshly entering in 1868. The other thing that really makes this move really significant as far as Maggie Walker's story is that this will put her right around the corner from our second stop, which is her church, First African Baptist Church. So again, for those of you still playing along at home, typing in addresses into your mapping software, go ahead and type in the address of 301 College Street. So that is 301 College Street, College, and go ahead and give you a second to do that. All right. If you were successful in doing that, what you should see on your screen is the intersection of College and Broad Streets. Broad, of course, being a major thoroughfare, kind of hard to miss. What we're looking for here is a kind of a large rectangular brick-shaped building, exposed brick, brick-shaped, but exposed brick on the outside. It has two white columns fronting College Street. And happy to say that unlike the Van Loo home, which is, of course, no longer with us, the building that was First African Baptist during Maggie Walker's life is still here. And so that is it. If you're looking at that building that I just described, you're looking at the right one. And just to convince you, here is a photograph of First African Baptist that was taken during Maggie Walker's lifetime. A lot should look familiar here. Of course, we see some major differences. The exterior appears to be white at the time on Maggie Walker's life. There's no longer the big steeple that we see on top of this anymore, but most of the exterior should seem pretty recognizable. And one of the reasons that the church building is still with us today is because the congregants of the church ended up selling it in the mid-1950s to what is now known as the VCU School of Medicine. And they are the current owners. They're actually using the building now as a clinical laboratory. So it's a building that we're thankful is still here. You can see the exterior of it looking very similar to what Maggie Walker would have seen. However, the inside, of course, as you could guess, is not very similar. So again, wanted to share with you this photograph of the interior of First African Baptist. This photograph coming to us from the Library of Congress, and it's one of my favorites because it, to me, to my knowledge, is the only photograph that I have ever seen of the inside of First African Baptist during Maggie Walker's lifetime. And so really the only glimpse that we get into this really gorgeous physical backdrop that, for not just folks attending Sunday services and Wednesday prayer meetings, but community gatherings of all sorts, right? Weddings, funerals, you name it, emancipation celebrations, numerous emancipation celebrations were known to take place there. And so this was just a really, really gorgeous setting for that. I wish we could still see, but in any case, I've always felt that it's really difficult to overstate the significance of the church in Maggie Walker's lifetime because it ends up really having such a profound impact on both her personal and professional lives. On her personal side, we know that Maggie Walker joins the church in the spring of 1878. She was 13, going on 14. We don't know her to have had a religious affiliation prior to this moment, so this might have been her kind of formal introduction to Christianity, or perhaps specifically the Baptist faith. I'm not sure. But once this moment happens, once she joins the church, there is no turning back. She remains a very active, devoted member of the church for the remaining over 50 years of her life. We know that she meets and marries her husband, Armstead Walker Jr., there in 1886. The church will be the scene of multiple funerals for the Walker family, including her own in 1934. We know, of course, that we see numerous biblical references throughout her diaries that are in our archives. Anyone who's been on tour of her home at our site has likely seen all sorts of Christian imagery throughout the home as well. So really a big turning point in her personal life, really. And I think in her outlook on others, really affecting her sense of self and what her duty is and so forth. But on top of that, right, this is a place that will have a tremendous impact on her professional career because when she joins the church in 1878, the pastor at that time happened to be a man named James Holmes, who also happened to be a member of the Independent Order of St. Luke. So he gets the credit for introducing her to the order. And once again, we have a moment that once it takes place, there is no turning back. The rest is history at this point, because not only does she remain a member of the order for the rest of her life, she leads it for the final 35 years of her life. Of course, we have to remember, if you haven't connected this dot already, this is an organization called the Independent Order of St. Luke, right? So it's an organization that takes its name from St. Luke, the healer from the New Testament, really to symbolize their mission of providing insurance to members and helping to heal the sick and take care of the dying. And we know that the Independent Order of St. Luke did most of its recruiting out of the Baptist and Methodist churches. We see biblical references show up in just about every one of Maggie Walker's professional speeches. The symbol for the Independent Order of St. Luke was also a red Christian cross. So again, everything, this is a faith and a place that provides really kind of a pivotal turning point for Maggie Walker in her life. And, history is full of what ifs. It's always kind of fun to entertain those from time to time. And I think one of them with Maggie Walker is, had her family not moved to where she was, right around the corner from the church, had she not have been introduced to the church at a young age and introduced to the Independent Order of St. Luke, would we be talking about her? Would she have gone on to all the amazing things that she went on to later in life? And of course, it's impossible to say. But this is clearly a moment that really sets her on the path to greatness. And so we're lucky to have that church still with us today, or at least the building, at least. So speaking of her professional career, I did want to now transition over to our third stop, which is going to be Maggie Walker's office building, otherwise known as St. Luke Hall. And so again, for those of you putting in addresses in your websites and apps, go ahead and type in the address of 900 St. James Street. So 900 St. James Street, ST. You don't have to type out the word Saint, but ST, James Street, ST again. And this one, again, should be pretty easy to find. There's not a lot of development around it at the time. And so what we're looking for on your screen is a 4-story brick building. Looks tan in color. Should have the words St. Luke Building. They're in big letters right there along St. James Street. So pretty easy to find. And just in case you are questioning the fact that that is the right building, let me show you a couple of photos that ought to convince you otherwise. The first one here is of St. Luke. Oh, sorry. Had them backwards. This one is the St. Luke Hall when it was soon after it was first built in 1903. That's near the intersection of St. James and Baker Streets. As you can see, starting out as a 3-story building. In fact, if you look closely at the current building, you can see the outline of where those 3 stories used to be. Is a little bit of a different color to the bricks there on the first 3 floors as there is to the rest. In 1918, though, Maggie Walker will have the 4th floor and a southern wing added to the building, bringing it up to its current look. This is a photograph taken of St. Luke Hall, we believe, around 1922, perhaps, but showing it in a way that should be pretty familiar to those of us that are looking at it today or that could pass by it. And once again, we do have a situation here that's pretty similar to First African Baptist, right? We have an exterior that is pretty familiar. The interior, though, is once again a very different story. We know that the Independent Order of St. Luke actually sold the building to a local family back in the 1970s. So it's been under private ownership for about the last 50 years. It just recently opened up as an apartment building that is being called Maggie Walker's St. Luke Building Apartments. So it's new chapter kind of actively being written as we speak. So you can't go inside and see it these days the way you could have seen it back then. But if you were able to do that, you would have seen a very unique set of sites. We know the printing press for her newspaper was down in the basement. At times there was retail space there along St. James Street. And then the upper floors contained an auditorium for hundreds of folks, perfect for Independent Order of St. Luke gatherings, local community meetings, and so forth. And then also office space, including Maggie Walker's office, which was always on the top floor. But on any given day, this building was really brimming with activity. We know that Maggie Walker's office staff topped out at around 60 during her career, most of them, again, being women employed in positions that you didn't typically see women doing at the time, right? Typesetting, doing work as stenographers, accountants, bookkeepers, managing the whole office staff, running the printing press, etc. And so Mrs. Walker, I think really, we know, makes an effort over the years to try to bring as many people into St. Luke Hall to see these sites, again, to kind of remind folks that this is an economic engine. This is really helping to bring needed change into the world, providing job opportunities specifically to women who didn't often have them, but as her way of increasing the wealth among African Americans and really moving the entire race forward. But I think we also have to consider the exterior of the building too. We know that meant a lot as far as Maggie Walker was concerned in terms of what it symbolized. And I think the way we see the image of St. Luke Hall treated over the years certainly reminds us that she was a consummate business person, one who certainly had a keen eye for the power of branding and marketing, because oftentimes when the Independent Order of St. Luke takes out ads in papers, it has an image of St. Luke Hall. And I just wanted to give you an example of that. This is one advertisement that showed up in about 3 years worth of newspapers back between 1906 and 1908. I think this particular one comes from the Washington Bee. You can see there's a lot of text down there. Don't expect you to read it all, but of course, the main thing that attracts your eye, of course, is that image of St. Luke Hall right there. It's part of her way of really trying to get the word out that the organization had its own office building. That was a really big deal. And I think you have to believe that this is a building that she always understood was going to help her do her job. Her main job as the leader of the Independent Order was to grow it. And of course, we know she does an incredible job at that, but that was a bit of a tricky thing to do because back at that time, there were dozens of other Black fraternal orders out there in the country, a lot of them doing things very similar to the Independent Order of St. Luke in terms of offering insurance to their members. But Maggie Walker, had to make a case to people about what distinguishes the Independent Order of St. Luke from these other organizations. Certainly not trying to say anything bad about them. She was actually a member of multiple fraternal orders herself, but really just trying to make a very powerful pitch about what sets the Independent Order of St. Luke apart from others. And of course, she had her work kind of cut out for her. Of course, being the only woman in the leadership role in an organization like that, of course, really making an organization that catered more to the needs of women than anything else were two very unique factors that she could always and did always point to. The fact that it was running a bank and newspaper and a department store was not wholly unique, but still pretty rare within the fraternal world. But also what was unique, and she knew that, was that it was an organization that had its own office building and a very state-of-the-art building that it had built for themselves. And when we have to imagine, what she wanted people to get out of that, I think it's worth kind of comparing, our sense of kind of wonder to a degree when we go into a downtown section of a city and we look up at these tall buildings that have businesses on the outside. Really, that could tell us a lot of things, but in most cases, I'm willing to bet that's saying, the outward signs there are a wealth of significance, of power. And I think Maggie Walker really understood that, to the extent that St. Luke Hall represented that, and I think it did, that's going to help people turn their minds around and decide to join the order as well. And I think just to give us a sense of how powerful a symbol it was to folks outside of the Independent Order of St. Luke, I want to read you my favorite quote. It comes from a correspondent from a Black newspaper called the Washington Bee, who visited Richmond back in 1914. And he said this. He said, "A trip to Richmond and a failure to see the St. Luke Hall and the St. Luke Bank would be like going to Washington, D.C. on a sightseeing tour and not seeing the Capitol and the White House." All right, I'll let that sink in for a minute. You might say that sounds maybe a little on the exaggerated side, maybe a little hyperbole. I would argue, though, that this is exactly how Maggie Walker wanted this building to be interpreted, right? Not just a symbol of her success in the Independent Order of St. Luke's success in Richmond, but as a national beacon of Black success during the Jim Crow era. Certainly not a political building like the Capitol and White House, but one that certainly exuded power at that time in a very powerful way on a national scale. So I'm sure she was happy to have read that, assuming that she did. Now, speaking of success and power on a national scale, I did want to finally get to our final stop today, which is Maggie Walker's Bank. So we're now going to pull away from St. Luke Hall and head south. We're in the neighborhood at this point of Jackson Ward. This was Richmond's largest, predominantly African neighborhood during Maggie Walker's lifetime. It's where her home is that we give tours of. And this is a site that was not far from where we are as a site. It was right around the corner at 1st and Marshall Streets. The address is 329 North 1st Street. So again, 329 North 1st, as in the number 1, ST, North 1st Street. So I'll go ahead and give you a minute to plug that in. All right, so hopefully you all have that pulled up on your screen. What you should see at this point, if you're in the ballpark of this area, is the intersection of North 1st and Marshall Streets. What should be somewhere visible on your screen is a parking lot on one side. This is actually in the southeast corner of 1st and Marshall, and a brick building kind of right across the street from it on the southwest corner of 1st and Marshall, bearing the name Premier Bank. If you can see those two places, keep your screen where it is. You are in the right spot. And the first thing I want to do, since this is about the most complicated landscape that we're dealing with today, is to explain it a little bit, because it is very different than anything Maggie Walker new and had ever seen. So, unfortunately, again, we are talking about a building that is no longer with us today. The site of Maggie Walker's bank, or at least where she last remembered it, is where we see that parking lot today at the southeast corner, First and Marshall. What ends up happening is that the folks who ran the bank in the mid 1970s decided to actually upgrade the building and have the brick building that's across the street from it, the one the Premier Bank is currently in. They have that one built for themselves. They move into that in the mid 70s, and soon after have the old building torn down. And of course, from their standpoint, this was a big upgrade. Of course, from a historic preservation perspective, it's a very sad moment. But in any case, that's why the bank building is no longer with us today, and why we see what we see today. On top of that, I also wanted to briefly go over the name changes of the bank. I think this is also important to at least clearing the story a bit. We know that the name of the bank changes twice during Maggie Walker's lifetime. When she starts it in 1903, it's the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. It'll change its name in 1923 to the St. Luke Bank and Trust Company. And then finally in 1929 and 1930, when she orchestrates a merger between her bank and the two remaining Black-owned banks in Richmond, they form what becomes known as Consolidated Bank and Trust Company. So that is the last name of the bank that Maggie Walker would have remembered. Consolidated, I should point out, will continue to operate in Richmond as a Black-owned bank, as a locally owned bank, into the year 2005. So racking up 102 years of history there. For decades, it was the longest or the oldest continuously operated Black-owned bank in America. So a huge feather in Maggie Walker's cap. One thing that she, again, would be very proud to know if she were able to know that. But ultimately, Consolidated Bank gets bought out first in 2005 by a small bank chain. That chain that buys them out in 2005 ends up getting bought out themselves in 2009 by a chain called Premier Bank, which is the reason why that is there today. So, I often get the question at the site, is Maggie Walker's bank still around? That's always a great question. And my answer to that is always yes and no, right? No, in the sense that, right, we're talking about a very different scenario, right? It's no longer locally owned. It's no longer Black owned. It's not in the same location. The name has changed, et cetera. But yes, in the sense that Premier Bank wouldn't be where it is. There wouldn't be a bank there if it wasn't for what Maggie Walker started. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Hopefully, for those of you who were able to pull up a view of the bank on your screen, you can see that there is a kind of a triangular shaped brick clock tower out in front. And one of the neat things that's happened out there recently is that the bank gave permission to a local artist to do a little triptych of paintings at the base of that clock tower. Perhaps you see it somewhere on your screen. That highlights the first three presidents of the bank. Maggie Walker, of course, gets the most prominent location. She's really facing the intersection of First and Marshall. But on the other two sides are her two successors, a man named Emmett Burke and then Walter Banks. And so what I like about that is that it makes it, right, even though we are talking about a very, again, a much more complicated landscape, a lot to keep in mind in order to connect Maggie Walker to that place, right? The painting that's there certainly helps do that. In fact, Consolidated Bank and Trust had also put up a stone tablet across the street near where the old bank was to kind of remind people of that as well. So it's now a lot easier for walkers and passerbys at that location to connect her to the site. Well, one thing I did want to kind of point out about the bank, especially since it's no longer here, is to show you a photograph of it. This is of the bank when not long after it was built. Maggie Walker had it constructed on that site in 1911. This was the third location of the bank, the most permanent location. You can see a nice, really attractive corner entrance there. Some nice 1920s cars right out there in front. And again, because it's no longer with us and we can't even come close to going to the inside, here's a great photograph that we love to show that shows you the inside of the bank that fortunately Maggie Walker actually is in. We see her, on the other side here, she's standing just behind the teller cage with what appears to be Emmett Burke, who was her cashier. Her son Russell, we believe, is the man in the background. And then the woman over there on either your left or right, depending on your screen, is likely Mary Dawson. She was Maggie Walker's assistant cashier there at the bank for many years. To kind of wrap up, I know that, when we think about the significance of the bank, I think it's certainly worth, again, kind of revisiting the context of Maggie Walker's life. And in this case, to remember that she was a member of the first generation of African Americans to really come of age in the wake of slavery. And one of the things that she and other members, very prominent members of her generation, thinking about folks like Booker T. Washington, Mary McLeod Bethune, Annie Helen Burroughs, W.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and others. One of the things that they really highly prioritize during their time is by starting organizations and institutions that make it possible for African Americans to live lives defined mostly by independence and self-determination. In other words, to make it possible for African Americans to lead lives as different as the lives led under slavery as humanly possible. And so when when you start to think about all the major things, again, back to this idea of all the freedoms, all the different kinds of freedoms that African Americans start to experience, many for the first time in the wake of the Civil War, right? Choosing where you get to live is one. But also, right, when you start to think about the role banks play in this factor, right? For the millions of enslaved, for hundreds of years, right? One of the defining features of slavery was working and no pay, right? All this money is going to benefit the slave owners and not yourself. And so I guess in this era, fresh out of the Civil War, just barely a generation removed, the role of banks takes on really new significance, right? As sites where you can actually start to build wealth, keep it, right? Save it, build it up, pass it along, generationally. Of course, it's also a site, right, where you can really get on that path to economic independence, right? Get a loan to start a business, to buy your own home, to buy a car, et cetera, and really help, build up the black middle class, which was really in its nascent stages at the time. So a real fundamental part of Maggie Walker's overall strategy to uplift African Americans using economics to do it. And you can, the bank was just so critical as far as that is concerned. Well, that about wraps me up. I did want to finish off with one great quote, my favorite quote ever written about Maggie Walker, if I can find it here. And this was written about her in 1934. Cannot seem to find it. But this is a great quote that was written by a man named A.W. Brown. He was the pastor at 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church. And he knew Maggie Walker quite well over the years, and he writes this in December of 1934. And this is freshly in the wake of Maggie Walker's death. There, I found it. And he's one of hundreds of people who write out testimonials to Maggie Walker and gets them published in newspapers. So they're really accessible now, especially if you have access to newspaper database. But it's one that really, I think, greatly summarizes what we're talking about today. He says, friends need not build any monument to Mrs. Maggie L. Walker. She did that better than any other mortal ever could while she was alive. She erected a material monument in brick, stone, and mortar in the bank building and in the spacious office building of the St. Luke Order. And she erected a spiritual monument in the hearts of the boys and girls and the men and women of our race who heard her speak, read what she wrote, or what others wrote about her. There is nothing that we can do save to perpetuate these monuments by preserving what she has done for generations yet unborn. Whew. Powerful stuff. I can think of no other quote, at least that I've come across, that not only beautifully encapsulates, our mission here in the National Park Service of preserving historic sites for future generations, but also really what our mission is really as a current generation of folks. Of course, we have to remember A.W. Brown is writing about her at a time when, the memory of Maggie Walker is still very fresh. This is 1934. She's just passed away. A lot of people she knew were still around. The Independent Order of St. Luke was thriving. Lots of her family members were still there, were still around, who knew her. But we're in a different moment now, historically, right? The Independent Order of St. Luke dissolved in the 1980s. Maggie Walker, of course, no longer with us. There are lots of descendants out there. We're lucky to see quite a few of them at our site. But the oldest ones among them were born after Maggie Walker had passed away. So just a reminder that the burden of making sure Maggie Walker's memory and legacy continues is on us, right? It's now on the shoulders of people who never got a chance really to know her. But makes it all the more important to keep sharing her story, to preserve our site. It's part of what makes it such an honor to work where I do, and to make sure that her story is one that continues to inspire generations and one that never disappears from the history books. So thank you all again for joining me today. I know I went a little bit over time. I hope that wasn't too bad, but really enjoyed being able to share all of this information with you. Want to close, of course, I also plugging our next two virtual programs. We're going to be doing what's called a virtual visitor center 2 days from now on Friday. That's going to be from 2 to 3 p.m. So log on back to our Facebook page for that. We're going to actually show our introductory film for the first 20 minutes and then answer questions about it afterwards. So that's going to be from 2 to 3 p.m. this Friday. And then our other Ranger Mike, he is going to do another program like this, a Facebook Live program on May 13th, talking about what he calls former facts about Miss Maggie. So addressing a lot of things that had been known about Maggie Walker, thought to have been true, that since have been altered, right? With new evidence coming to light, things that have now changed our minds about things that we thought we once knew about Maggie Walker. So should be an exciting program. Hope you all tune in, and thank you again for joining me today. Thank you to our two co-hosts, the Richmond National Battlefield Park, our sister park. We love working with them. And then also the National Park Foundation, who has really been a big advocate for parks, especially parks promoting virtual programs like this and online resources for the parks during this unprecedented time. So be safe, be healthy out there, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person very soon once this is all over. Thanks again, y'all.